We move on to Alfred Schutz, personal versus intersubjective consciousness. We see that Schutz started with the critique of Weber's analysis of social action. That's Verstehen. So, establishing the subjective meaning of individual's action is not as simple as Weber had suggested. So we see that in Weber's approach, we have to look into how the individual interprets the reality. So that means how the individual experiences that reality. Now, can, let's say, a researcher really get hold of that experience, the experience which the individual has? Will the researcher also have the same experience? Is it possible? For Schutz, it is not possible for anyone to enter someone else's stream of consciousness and have the identical subjective experience. So it is very difficult. And somebody might say, even the same person, if wants to have the same experience, it may be difficult to have. He may not be in a position to have the same experience. Depends whether that reality is repeated exactly the same way, and that's the difficulty with the human behavior. So for Schutz, it is impossible even when the other person is well known to the observer and the action is being observed as it actually takes place. Now, will this person have the same experience? For Schutz, it is it's next to possible. So when the other person's, secondly, he says, when the other person's behavior is accompanied by observable facial indicators of subjective states, even then it is difficult to experience. Facial expressions might indicate the happiness, the joy, the sadness, the frustration, the anger, and could be many other things. Even a person is looking at those, but then how the person interprets those facial, let's say, expressions. So perceived information through the observer's own perceptual and cognitive framework. So whatever the person perceives, that has to be interpreted, and that interpretation is in the light of the observer's framework. Now that perception may not be identical with the, let's say, action of the individual who's being observed. So this cannot be identical. So it is going to be different. Also, what about knowing the effects of action? So first was the interpretation of the action, and then what about the effects of that action? These effects a person is trying to, let's say, get from the narrative which is being given to the person by the individual who had that experience. Now, is this narration same or similar or equal to something which is being observed as it actually happens? I think it is not. It's not going to be similar. Now that's the approach which, let's say, people might be following. So Weber did not indicate whether the subjective meaning applies to, let us say, two things. One, during the time that an action is taking place, subjective meaning of the person's, the subject who's being observed, is that meaning applied to the actual situation when that action is taking place, or is this meaning after that action has been completed? And when we talk about the after, that might be something about the effects. For Schutz, the two are not necessarily the same. So the subjective meanings of a particular action have to be, let's say, interpreted in a certain framework. And that's where the problem comes. And these interpretations can vary. So meanings can vary. And this variation can be the context in which that meaning is being interpreted. Context or the framework being, let's say, used for its analysis, for its interpretation. Look at the, let's say, person or a student reading a textbook. Why the person is reading this textbook? Maybe he is trying to fulfill an assignment, or he is trying to, let's say, increase his knowledge, and maybe he is trying to fulfill a requirement of the course in which a person is registered. So there could be different, let's say, meanings of this reading the textbook, and meanings can vary from, as I said, from framework to framework. So what is the goal of that action? So attribution of meaning, so attaching the meaning to the action is a reflective process after the action has, after an action takes place. So that's one way to look at. But still, we can also anticipate the meaning of some goal-directed action. So we can define that in advance as well. Just like the student is trying to read the textbook for, let's say, achieving a goal, and that goal could be getting a degree, and that degree could be means to, let's say, for a career, and that career could be again means to something else. So this reading a book is there, but the goal is there, and that can be a lengthy process to interpret that. So the meaning of action may be having a temporal, let's say, dimension. So it could be unique at individuals, let's say, time of his, let's say, life. It could be different with respect to the background which a person has during the life course. So impossible to answer, let's say, for Schutz, it's impossible to enter the stream of consciousness of another person or to have exactly the same subjective experience. But still, people have sufficient level of, let's say, mutual understanding. So we see that we gain insight into some aspects of another subjective thoughts and feelings, and thoughts and feelings we come to know through communication. And for this communication, we need language. So language helps in the expression and sharing of the subjective feelings, thinking, intentions, and experiences, and that is how people look at that. So this whole process contributes to the accumulation of shared, let's say, stock of knowledge, which we call as intersubjective kind of understanding. So our assumption is that other people's subjective experiences are probably similar to what ours would be in similar circumstances. Just like people experiencing a calamity, an earthquake, and when other people go through that, experience that kind of thing, they might be, let's say, experiencing the same kind of things.